To kind of set the stage for all this, I'm going to read something that I wrote. Some of you know that I'm part of the Not Yet Dead Poets Society here in town. In fact, I'm the founder of that, and it has a byline, which is the Remedial Reading and Writing Group. So we don't take ourselves too seriously. However, we do have some Pulitzer Prize nominees in there. We have a lot of writers, a lot of published people. It's a good bunch to be a part of, and I'm very thankful for that. So I'm going to read this first one. I've got a bunch of stuff to read, but I won't, so don't worry about it. And, anyway, I've had fun doing this. It's been a very useful process for me. This one's just called Bad Poetry is What I Do Best. Bad poetry is what I do best. Poor word choice, my cup of tea. Syntactic ineffectiveness, I'm blessed. But a poet's heart beats inside of me. Grammatical confabulations, I excel. Obscure word meanings to boot. Rhyme choices are straight from, well, vague storylines are my strong suit. Participles dangling around my head. Lost constructions of scheme and beat. Worse poetry could not be read. Sentence fragments fall round my feet. Like detritus from a polluted sea, cluttered mind and cluttered desk, unfinished poems are surrounding me. Bad poetry is what I do best. So the topic today, at least, it started out to address a couple of things. One, the cathartic nature of poetry. Okay, it kind of morphed, but included that, and then went on to gaining personal insight through poetry. So that's what I'm going to read, bits and pieces, and then I'll try to cut it short and cram it into the time available. Start off, we'll look a little bit at the philosophy and the poet. You know, what's the difference between the philosopher and the poet? George Santayana said, philosophy is something reasoned and heavy, poetry something winged, flashing, inspired. It is the acme of life to understand life. The height of poetry is to speak the language of the gods. And the poet writes not so much for the public, and I found this to be true, as he does for himself. Poetry is clearly a cathartic endeavor. I'm not going to argue that. I don't think anybody would. We often write to gain control over a situation and to put together a logical construct that can give inner peace. It is like the calendar of events that gives us order to our lives. It can be the Franklin planner or the smartphone, when properly used, of the modern age. Set it and forget it. It is particularly true for the soldier who experiences the horrors of war for all the reasons that one might imagine. Loss of control, moral conflict, physical discomfort, guilt. Since we are remembering the 100th anniversary of the Great War, WW1, and how did they know? The Great War. It should be interesting to note that there was a significant rise in poetry at that time. The soldier poets were active in the trenches, writing home, crafting their philosophies, trying to make sense of it all. Kipling said that this poetic inspiration for the poem If. Now, how many people had to memorize If? Do you remember? One. I read over at Morning Point. I read that to them. Every person in there, and there was probably 8, all had memorized that. And they could just run right along with me. You know, so amazing. Kipling, in his poetic inspiration for the poem If, was the military actions of Leander Starr Jameson, leader of the failed Jameson raid in 1895-1896 against South Africa to overthrow the Boer government of Paul Kruger, some 15 years prior to his publication. That failure of that mercenary coup d'etat aggravated the political tensions between Great Britain and the Boers, which led to the Second Boer War, which occurred in 1899 and 1902. And I'm going to read just a little bit of it, not a lot, and then I'll read the end lines of it. But it's one of those that as soon as I read the first line, you'll say, I remember that, whether you actually memorize it or not. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowances for the doubting too, If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor walk too well. And I'll skip down towards the end. It says, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and what's more, you'll be a man, my son. I could list probably dozens, if not hundreds, of poems written by the not yet dead poets over the last 9 years. We meet weekly, by the way. Every Thursday we meet for an hour, maybe two. I know some of you have been there. It's a good bunch once you kind of get into it. It takes a little while to do that. For those that have come and gone, come back. It depends on when you get there. It varies. We get into philosophical discussions and that sort of thing. But I've seen the cathartic process over and over and over again from a lady who's a stalwart supporter of the group who lost her husband, has no idea where, has some idea where, but he went down with a plane carrying a drill bit, I think it was, to South America from up north. She didn't know, still doesn't know where he went down. Anyway, they have struggled with all sorts of things: death, disease, loss of a spouse, alienation, and war terrors. A young man who came in when we were meeting over at Java Time some years ago was a Marine, and he was struggling with the moral dilemma that he had when he had to shoot someone. He grew up in our church over there, very moral young man, and yet that tore him up. So the effects of war show up a lot. And if you ever need somebody to talk about war and poetry, get Robbie Del Camp. Robbie is the organist, actually, at All Saints Chapel at Swanee. You guys know him, I'm sure. But his hobby is collecting poetry from World War I. And he's got a very extensive library. And he gave a talk to the EQB, which is Ecce Quambonum. It's the faculty club for Swanee, just last week, and it was phenomenal. I've got a reading list here that he provided, so if you're interested in that, you're welcome to it. So, how does one develop a personal philosophy through poetry? Well, my thesis is that we can use poetry or writing as means towards the development of a personal philosophy. A handbook, if you wish, on how the world works, or how we would hope the world works. So we are now dipping into the world of the philosopher who endeavors to apply rules of logic and reason to our experiences. It would seem that no two creatures could be more dissimilar than the poet and the philosopher. Who but a philosopher is disturbed by the deepest questions of meaning and wishes to make a vocation out of solving the knottiest problems of truth and knowledge, morals, logic, existence, and death? And who else but a poet can declare herself exempt from the strictures of conceptual thought, free to tamper with words to achieve any musical or playful effect her mood requires? The philosopher must be mindful of method and pay careful attention to assertions, evidence, arguments, ambiguities, facts. His work must withstand the most thoroughgoing scrutiny. The poet's work need only be a good performance, entertaining, soulful, humorous, clever. A poem should not mean, but be, said Archibald MacLeish in Ars Poetica, on the art of poetry. Some of the profoundest sages have condensed their thoughts into poetic form, from the early Buddhists, right up to Emerson and Santayana and Khalil Gibran. And the dividing line between the philosopher is blurred. Meditation, for example, can be considered central to both. And therein where you can write poetry, I think, and you're in form of meditation, at least I am. trying to find connections that you would not normally find. When poets walk onto the philosopher's stage, we turn descriptive and metaphorical powers towards the weightiest of themes, considerations of the right and the good, speculation about mortality and eternity, or vignettes on the natural world. Not having a thesis to defend or an argument to advance, one's imagination can be released to address all sorts of philosophical conjecture, having in mind that the general idea of what is to be done, the poet proceeds. So I'm going to give you an example of philosophical poetry. You might relate to this probably as much as anybody. The Tao Te Ching, it depends on how you want to pronounce it anyway. There's a poem that it kind of is philosophical, scientific in some sense, and yet it speaks to us at a different level. It's very simple. It's only a few lines. A man is supple and weak when living, but hard and stiff when dead. Grass and trees are pliant and fragile when living, but dried and shriveled when dead. Thus the hard and the strong are the comrades of death. The supple and weak are the comrades of life. Therefore a weapon that is strong will not vanquish. A tree that is strong will suffer the axe. The strong and big takes the lower position. The supple and weak takes the higher position. My physicist mind, which that's my training, first turns to forces and the dynamics of material interactions and find the philosophical theme generally scientifically true. Yet my poetic mind finds the lessons of Jesus, the Buddha, clearly in front of me. Lao Tzu, the poet, addresses a life truth in a suppler and more limpid form. In these short lines, he is able to illustrate the meaning of paradox quite well. Further, his words invite a second reading, further introspection, and examination. So what is it about poetry that facilitates personal philosophy? I've got several degrees. One is in engineering, one is as a physicist. But I see the distinction between engineer and physicist a little bit in this manner. The difference is that an engineer is paid to think inside the box. You don't want an engineer designing a bridge that you're going to have to go across outside the box. A physicist is paid to think outside the box and therefore is free to roam a little bit, and he becomes the physicist researcher as opposed to the engineer rule abider, if you wish. Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica, let me read that. I think I could read that in its entirety. It shouldn't take too very long. A poem should be palatable. This is called Ars Poetica. A poem should be palatable, mute as globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as a sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless as in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases, twig by twig, the night entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true, falling all the history of grief, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. So, there are some rules. There's rules, obviously, for the philosopher. He adheres to logic. There's various rules of logic. So I'm talking about the Nobel Eightfold Path to Great Poetry. There's a little turn on the. So there are things there. So there are logical rules. The tools of the philosopher, which when applied to a particular metaphysical issue can provide insight and structure to understanding. Also, the poet has tools, not just the paper and quill, but guiding principles or rules. I'm calling them the Nobel Eightfold Path. These are commonly accepted rules of poetry, and I'll just allude to them a little bit. The path of Buddha begins with the word right, R-I-G-H-T, as in right view, right intentions, right speech, and right actions. To complete the Eightfold Path, one includes right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And I guess there are variations on that, and you probably know about those. Like great art, poetry is filled with intangible ingredients that defy description and duplication. Even scholars and professional poets cannot define what true great poetry is, but they've been able to define common elements found in great poetry. And I'll just list a few of them. One, you need to write with a unique perspective and original creativity. And that's certainly true of the great poets. Write using images in your poems, so they provide vivid detail that ignites the senses. We had one the other day that was just, oh man, it was just a sight, sound, smells, everything went into this one poem. We said, break it down. We do critiques of our stuff. It was great. It had allusions to all sorts of the senses. It ignited that part, but it was like a fire hose. And so we said, slow down. You're moving too fast. You got to make the moment last, I guess. Write your discord to avoid cliche expressions. Use simile and metaphors. That's a big one. Looking for those unique comparisons to help the reader understand the connections between compared terms. And in formal poems such as sonnets, one needs to kind of adhere to those. It needs to have a sense of rhythm also, following the natural rhythm of the spoken language, or the free rhythm, which should have some sort of a distinct beat. And it goes on. And there's use of rhyme or not use of rhyme, big question about whether you do that or not. Anyway, there are these rules, and that's all I'm trying to say. So the Nobel Eightfold Path could lead somebody to a Nobel Prize in Literature, which boo hiss, I hear it saying it. So how does poetry become a vehicle for personal philosophy, for developing a personal philosophy? I want you to ask why. Socrates suggested that the unexamined life is not worth living. Probably a bit of an exaggeration, rather brash statement that might not be taken literally, but it is cause enough to pursue it. For me, it is the process of applying the above rules, methods, and techniques that cause me to evaluate concepts and relationships in the light of my own personal experience. This makes them extremely personal, imbuing them with the resultant potent significance to me, the poet. As I said before, I think we write for ourselves, not for others. It's nice if somebody listens to us from time to time, but still, it's not necessarily what we go for. So I have several bits of personal philosophy, part of which we did on Wednesday night last summer. And I went back and I said, okay, if this is really what I think my world picture is all about, my world view is all about, it should show up in my writings. And sure enough, it did. So I've got several of them. One of which I'm not going to read to you. It's a little bit long. And it illustrates what I believe is that our experiences become the filters for our future. We see everything in terms of our past experiences, and those can start in different ways. The one that I was going to read to you basically suggests it goes actually into a church. I grew up in big churches, magnificent Gothic structures, and I looked and I saw kind of a divine plan in there, and I wrote about that. And I wrote about the boy who sees this, all the color, everything sharply in focus. It seems like there's a divine plan. And then I talk about the old man, and the metaphor was the building, the edifice, versus the divine plan. And the workers that chiseled that out and made it happen. In the last line it says, "Quiet now is the organ in all its magnificence, although there are still many voices triumphantly playing through the old man's thoughts. The rose-colored windows are still clearly in focus on the surfaces of his mind. Soon another cold, hard, purposely shaped stone will become his constant companion as the man blends into the divine. So that was my first kind of inspiration, I guess. The second one is a young lady who's 80 years old. She just recently held her own visitation. That's something to think about. And it was fun. It was a lot of fun. Her son, I'll tell you who it is, and I'm sure she would not mind me saying so, but I wrote this for her. Her name is Evelyn Wiseman. Now, Wiseman may or may not mean anything to you unless you're a country western person. We have at least one country western person here. He wrote Live Like You're Dying. That was one of his hit records. He was elected Songwriter of the Decade in 2009. Craig has done a lot for Second Harvest. He's raised about $1 million through benefits at the Ryman. I've attended a couple of those, which were a lot of fun. Anyway, Evelyn is the mom of this young man who's young because I'm old. That's the reason. And I wrote this because we go up to Swanee a lot. We go up every Wednesday, and Evelyn would come with me. And she was talking about her other son, Rex, who has a ministry over in Estill Springs. And Rex had one of his parishioners, if you want to call him that, one of his parishioners' mom was dying. And she was struggling with it, really struggling with it. And Rex asked his mom if she would go in and talk to her. And through various means, the woman became very calm, accepted the fact that she was dying. Sort of like Pat, you know, he says he's accepted that. And she passed in a very peaceful way. I thought that was wonderful. I said I would hope somebody could do that for me. I think I'm going to go kicking and screaming when the time comes. I'm not sure, but anyway. So this one I wrote, and it's called The Wise Bird. And I think I'm going to do a rewrite on it, but we'll see. We're not going to do that here. Trust me. A bird appears on the sill, chirping as if to a lost mate. She is intent upon the form on the bed. She is singing, "Here I am, here I am." A tired, dying woman on the other side of the glass thinks, no, she fears what is to come. She entreats, Lord, here I am, here I am. The spirit of the feathered orb transcends this earthly, transient life. She continues to sing, here I am, here I am. Chirps, strong and comforting, continue from this unlikely messenger, such a small, solitary being, and yet she stalwartly sings, here I am, here I am. Comforted by an encouraging song from the other side, a thin, fragile pane of glass, a soul passes, and the bird sings, here I am, here I am. And the philosophy behind that, in my personal philosophy, is that through just being here on earth, there's a certain benevolence of the earth towards us. We are here because of the fact that the earth does provide for us. And then we should, through that benevolence, we should reach out, touch each other, help each other. That's what that one represented to me when I got through with it. The third one, probably the last one here for this, read it. This is the personal philosophy here is number 3. It basically has to do with who we are, fundamentally. In my personal belief, and you may believe differently, and this is, why are we here? But my philosophy is that we are evolved, organic entities, intent upon and designed for self-replication and survival. That's simple. The scene painted is amoral, or at least it seems not to conflict with our sense of what is right, and does beg for resolution. So with that in mind, I wrote this thing. It is called Furry Feud. I can get through the alliteration. I'll see if I can make it right, make it come out right. Two stood in the field, dressed for the occasion, in basic black and stylish gray, equally illuminated by a warming sun. Where the others have stood, so do they, huddled motionless in a field of grain. Cat sees mousy as fun and prey. Each through experience or inbred skill, eye the other differently. One is the hunted, the other the kill. Shadows obscure them both, so finely dressed, between golden light filtered stalks, ripe with grain, awaiting the harvest. Mousy desires to scavenge bits of food. She sees no harm done other than to feed her empty belly and nurse a furry fledgling brood. Cat views the scenario as a game of hide and snack, honing feline hunting skills so that she might nurse a furry fledgling when she gets back. And I'm going to end with a philosophy that I have, and a lot of you I think share in some way. I'm sure different, but in some way. And that is that the universe does appear to be rational, mathematical, governed by the laws of physics. That's the physicist in me. And it's not the whims of a God that can be bent to our will, necessarily. We are truly at one with the universe. We may be part of the divine, or simpler yet, part of the divine dwells within us. While it may be wishful thinking that we are beautifully interrelated with the natural world, it does suggest that we are part of a system, each part reliant upon the other. Systems engineering, here's the engineering physicist part of me. Systems engineering suggests that we have made up of components, each of which, through various forces, affects the others, providing positive encouragement to others to build in magnitude, or through negative feedback to diminish the growth of the other components. Nonetheless, this poem is fundamentally derived from the Hindu acknowledgement of the divine in each other. It's called, I'll get the pronunciation right, I've worked and struggled on the pronunciation, Namaste. Namaste, is that close enough for everybody? Okay. Which really translates, I bow to the divine in you. Okay, I see that in you. The wind gathers below us, and upon gaining strength, moves steadily up the mountain, first gently, causing the hemlocks to bow gracefully in our direction. Spruce acknowledges the presence of the hemlocks. Namaste. Fern, still damp and cool from a morning shower, glimmer with dew, droplets once part of the sky and clouds, green masses of self-same shape gather. They too bow in acknowledgement of Earth's gifts. Namaste. Earth below our feet connects, supports, and grounds us. The winds increase, painted leaves flow around us, swirling softly, invading and engulfing our space, finding small pockets to nestle, molder, and decay. Namaste. Wind, your dynamics shape our universe. We are of dust and return we must. We respect you as we shall soon connect. Gently join earth and our spirits into one. Namaste.